Hello. Martin, Alex, and I are delighted to present a National Standard of Canada for REB review and oversight. We will focus our presentation on the following: what a national standard is, why national standards are important for human research and its ethical oversight, the differences between policies, standards, and procedures, who this particular National Standard of Canada is designed for, the normative references that were used to develop it, some highlights of this national standard, how to write procedures that meet this national standard, and the benefits of adopting it. I'd like to begin by outlining who develops national standards in Canada. The Standards Council of Canada, or SCC, a Crown corporation, accredits standards development organizations, or SDOs, to develop standards that meet the needs of industry, government, and consumers. SCC accredited SDOs are responsible for the development, publication, and maintenance of Canadian national standards. Currently, 12 SDOs have been accredited since SCC began operations a bit over 50 years ago. You may recognize some of them, like CSA, a logo that's stamped on virtually every light bulb, and HRSO, or Health Standards Organization, the SDO that develops national standards for healthcare. Among these SDOs is the SDO that we represent, Human Research Standards Organization, or HRSO. All SDOs are not-for-profit organizations, and many, like HRSO, do not charge users for the national standards that they develop. HRSO develops national standards of relevance to Canadians conducting, overseeing, and participating in human research. Its sister company is a conformity assessment organization called Human Research Accreditation Canada, or HRA Canada. The national standards developed by HRSO are used as the basis for HRA Canada's accreditation program. So why do we need national standards for human research? Generally speaking, national standards frame, guide, and normalize almost every aspect of our lives. In Canada, we have national standards pertaining to healthcare, information technology, accounting, agriculture, plumbing, electricity, and so on. That they all promote best industry practices, they emphasize safety and quality, and ensure the interoperability of such practices. National standards eliminate the variability in interpreting regulations, guidelines, and policies, and for human research, they provide stakeholders with clear, concise requirements upon which they can develop their procedures. National standards promote uniform conduct of human research, creating a research environment that is harmonized and collaborative. So what is the difference between a policy, a standard, and a procedure? These terms are often used interchangeably, and this has led to numerous misunderstandings of what governs human research in Canada. First of all, a policy tells us what is important and answers the question, why do I need to do this? It doesn't tell us what is required to do it or even how to do it. A standard assigns quantifiable measures to something and answers the question, what is required in order to do this? A procedure establishes the proper steps to take and answers the question, how do I do this? You may be familiar with procedures and their importance in maintaining operations, but without standards, when it comes to human research, we've been basing our procedures on our individual interpretations of policies and other regulatory and guidance documents, making it impossible to harmonize our practices and promote collaborations. An example of the interplay between policies, standards, and procedures comes from our policy governing human research, the Tri-Council Policy Statement. It states that consent shall be given voluntarily. I imagine that human researchers have procedures for obtaining voluntary informed consent from research participants, but that no two procedures are the same. And this is because the level of adherence to this policy is left up to individual interpretation. In our recently published National Standard of Canada, the HRSO Technical Committee developed requirements for this policy so that Canadian researchers can understand what is required to meet the policy when they write their procedures. So how does an SCC accredited SDO like HRSO develop a national standard? The first step in the process is the development of a proposal. A proposal is a document that describes the project need for the national standard, and this project need usually comes from stakeholders. In the case of HRSO, the project need can come from REB members, researchers, research administrators, Health Canada, sponsors, funders, other SDOs, and even research participants. The proposal is transformed into a notice of intent, which is then submitted to the Standards Council of Canada for publication. The draft national standard is developed from the proposal according to SCC accredited procedures, including the specific way in which requirements are written and expressed. National standards are developed from current policies, regulations, and guidelines, or what are referred to as normative documents or normative references. Recall that these documents tell us why I need to do this, and the national standard tells us what is required in order to do this. That is why a national standard is expressed through requirements that are easy to understand, unambiguous, complete, and accurate. A specific technical committee is established to develop the draft national standard. Because the published national standard must meet the interests of all stakeholders, it's very important that technical committee members represent a balance of concerned interest groups and come from all regions of Canada. Another way SDOs ensure that national standards meet the interests of all stakeholders is to release their draft national standards to the public for consultation for a set period of time. At HRSO, our public consultation period is 60 days. All comments, suggestions received from the public are addressed by the technical committee, and the draft national standard is revised, if necessary, to produce the final national standard. The Standards Council of Canada undergoes a review of the final national standard prior to publishing it in order to ensure that it fulfills all of their accreditation requirements. Published national standards are accessible to the public for use, and in our case, they're free of charge, and are maintained at regular intervals and revised when there are changes to or new normative documents. All decisions made during national standards development use the process of consensus decision-making. In general, consensus decision-making is a process for groups to generate widespread agreement in a way that respects the contributions of all participants. Why do we use consensus decision-making? To ensure that all opinions, ideas, and concerns are taken into account, and to find solutions that address all members' views, including those of minority groups. Consensus decision-making processes all share the following elements. They are inclusive, meaning as many stakeholders as possible are involved in group discussions. They are participatory, that all participants are allowed a chance to contribute to the discussion. They are collaborative. The group constructs proposals with input from all interested group members. They are agreement seeking. The goal is to generate as much agreement as possible. And most importantly, the process is cooperative. Consensus participants are encouraged to keep the good of the whole group in mind when making decisions. So thank you, and I would like to turn the presentation now over to Alex.
Thank you, Janice. Janice discussed the general NSC development process, and I will focus my presentation on our experience in the development of this particular NSC for the ethical review and oversight of human research. The technical committee was established by soliciting referrals from the technical steering committee members of HRSO, as well as from the previous technical committee members. Members of the public were also able to indicate an interest in participating on the technical committee by sending a message from the HRSO website. This particular technical committee included individuals like members of the PRE, Panel on Research Ethics, bioethicists, REB members, and administrators from across the country. Information sessions were held in August of 2020 so that prospective technical committee members could learn about the standards development process and also what time commitment would be involved in participation. After these meetings, prospective members could indicate their interest and willingness to participate. The first technical committee meeting was held on September 21st, 2020, and this is where the members were introduced to each other and a bit of education about the consensus process of decision-making took place. Further, the group learned about the procedures for developing national standards of Canada. Finally, the group determined the frequency and length of meetings for the process. This particular technical committee decided to have weekly meetings of 1.5 hours in duration. The discussions of the technical committee were rich and thoughtful and a learning process in and of itself. The different perspectives of the experts on the committee also highlighted the critical importance and need for national standards of Canada. As you can see by the Gantt chart on the slide, the technical committee took approximately 5 months over 21 meetings to develop the draft national standard of Canada for the ethical review and oversight of human research, after which there was a 60-day public consultation period. The public consultation period was advertised on the HRSO website, as well as through multiple messages disseminated on social media, specifically on LinkedIn and Twitter. The technical committee then reviewed over 100 comments received from the consultation, and it took 3 meetings to go through them all and make any necessary changes to the proposed draft national standard of Canada. Once complete, the draft national standard was submitted to the Standards Council of Canada for review and publication. It was formally published on June 16, 2021. Next slide, please. Now, who does this national standard of Canada apply to? This NSC applies to all individuals as well as all for-profit and not-for-profit, public and private organizations engaged in the ethical review and oversight of human research, such as those involved in establishing, administering, and ensuring effective REB operations, and also regulatory authorities and other organizations that evaluate REBs. Next slide, please. Canada has a fragmented regulatory approach to research involving humans. There are federal guidelines for institutions receiving federal funds issued by the Interagency Panel on Research Ethics, and federal guidelines on research integrity and conflict of interest are issued by the Interagency Advisory Panel on Responsible Conduct of Research. Canada has federal regulations for health research involving investigational drugs, medical devices, and natural health products issued by Health Canada. Canada also has varying federal and provincial regulations relating to privacy of personal health information. In addition, there are federal regulations for radiation safety, transportation of dangerous goods, the use of controlled goods, and biosafety, just to name a few. This complex regulatory environment makes it difficult for research institutions to adequately oversee the conduct of research involving humans that may involve some or all of these regulations and guidelines. As a policy, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, or TCPS, is the joint policy of Canada's 3 federal research agencies: the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It was developed to serve as a mechanism to control those institutions receiving federal funding from the 3 federal granting councils and only extends to these organizations. The TCPS informs and provides guidance to Canadian researchers on what is important and why regarding the ethical conduct of research involving humans. Currently, REBs use the guidance of the TCPS in their determination of ethical feasibility of human research. As Janice mentioned, the TCPS does not apply to all REBs in Canada because the TCPS is a policy. Its interpretation varies from one organization to another, from one province to another, creating barriers to harmonization, collaboration, and growth of the industry sector within Canada and internationally. Similarly, Canada's Food and Drugs Act and applicable regulations incorporate an internationally accepted good clinical practice guideline that stipulates that interventional or clinical research on humans cannot be initiated without the review and approval by a properly constituted REB or IRB. This is the International Council for Harmonization Good Clinical Practice Guideline, or ICH-GCP, which is an international standard for one type of human research, clinical research. The ICH-GCP guideline has been adopted by Health Canada and provides a basis for the work of the Health Products and Food Branch Inspectorate. However, the regulations only apply to interventional or clinical research and do not include policies or standards pertaining to how REBs determine a favorable outcome. Many organizations conducting other forms of research involving humans are therefore not covered by these regulations. This NSC uses these Canadian normative documents in addition to the US Code of Federal Regulations, as well as others shown on this slide. Next slide, please. As previously indicated, there are systematic procedures that must be followed by an SDO in the development of national standards of Canada, including the constitution of a technical committee that is representative of the diversity of the country in terms of geography and user categories. These committees use a consensus approach to developing standards, and the process includes a public consultation phase for feedback before publication. There must be a balance of concerned interest groups, combining the efforts of Canadian research administrators, researchers, bioethicists, regulators, sponsors, policymakers, insurers, auditors, and research participants in the development of HRSO's national standards. In addition, one of the primary ethical justifications for conducting human research is to benefit society. Therefore, feedback from the public is integral to the development of NSCs. Now, Martin Letendre will review some of the innovations and highlights of this new national standard of Canada.
Thank you very much, Alex. Alex referred to the Canadian regulatory environment as being fragmented, with variable applications depending on the funding, location, or nature of research. The Canadian regulatory environment could be seen as a clump of rules, out of which the Technical Committee of HRSO, through its work, acted as a spinning wheel to produce a uniformed string of requirements. The NSC proposes a practice-oriented interpretation of the normative documents, providing for its users the tools to develop procedural documents that are logical and easy to implement. The National Standard of Canada also proposes a novel and holistic approach as it embraces all research with humans. It also organized the requirements in a way that follows the natural flow of research. Let's explore some examples over the next slides. As you read the technical requirements on ethical review and oversight of research, you will notice that they follow the life cycle of human research, starting with the requirements for the initial review of research, leading to the requirements for the oversight of research once REB approval is granted, and ending with the requirements for the review of research at the time of its conclusion. Ethics oversight requirements distinguish between the procedures needed for the ongoing reporting and review of research events and the procedures to be developed for the continuing review of research, often referred to as the annual review, since normative documents require that research be reviewed by the REB at a minimum on an annual basis. Finally, the National Standard of Canada establishes the requirements for REBs to consider a study closed or for early suspension or termination of ethics approval. Next slide, please. Another example of the practice-oriented approach of the NSC is its writing structure. Each subsection is preceded by a categorical statement, providing for a bird's eye view of the technical requirements of the NSC. The categorical statement is then followed by a detailed listing of the elements that an organization's procedural document must contain in order to meet the requirements of the categorical statement. Therefore, an institutional official could have a broader understanding of the technical requirements of the NSC by simply reading the categorical statements, while quality assurance professionals and REB administrators will want to understand the technical requirements specificity. In the next slides, we will look at the technical requirements for the REB's mandate and constitution to illustrate the structure of the NSC. The REB's mandate and constitution has 4 categorical statements. On this slide, we can read the first 2. Number 1, that the REB shall function in accordance with procedural documents to determine the types of research that it is mandated to review and oversee. Number 2, the REB shall function in accordance with procedural documents that establish and maintain its composition and ensure that its members have the expertise, independence, and multidisciplinary background essential for a competent ethical review and ongoing evaluation of the research under its auspices. Next slide, please. The third categorical statement pertains to the REB administration and resources. The categorical statement is then followed by the specific elements that must be included in an organization's procedural documents. This specific subsection illustrates very well the NSC's practice-oriented approach. Indeed, the REB administration plays a fundamental role in the proper functioning of a REB. While its role is mentioned in the Tri-Council policy statement, it is not mentioned in the ICH guidelines on good clinical practice. The NSC, therefore, provides a harmonized interpretation of the Canadian normative references, allowing for a pan-Canadian uniformed approach, regardless of where the research is being conducted, who funds the research, or what is the research discipline. Next slide, please. Another example of the harmonized interpretation of the Canadian normative references is the 4th categorical statement under the section on the mandate and structure of the REB, where the requirements for multi-jurisdictional research detailed under Chapter 8 of the Tri-Council policy statement will now find application regardless of the nature of the organization, its source of funding, or the type of research. As mentioned previously by Janice, the National Standard of Canada does not replace policies such as the Tri-Council policy statement. As we can see here, the details found under Chapter 8 of the TCPS maintain their pertinence and utility in identifying the issue and scope pertaining to multi-jurisdictional research. What the National Standard of Canada does here is assigning the requirement that Canadian REBs who follow this NSC must apply their procedures uniformly to all research under its auspices, regardless of where the research is concluded. Next slide, please. As indicated earlier in this presentation, NSCs promote the uniform conduct of all human research. Here is another example of a requirement that takes into consideration 2 important normative references, the Tri-Council policy statement and the ICH guidelines on good clinical practice. While the former places emphasis on the efficient reporting of decisions, the latter provides specificity as to the information to be conveyed to researchers in the REB letter. The NSC harmonized both texts to establish requirements that can be applied to all research with humans. Next slide, please. In other circumstances, the NSC provides clarification about existing normative references that, for some reasons, were subject to a variety of interpretations by Canadian research organizations. This was the case, for example, with reconsiderations and appeals of REB decisions. Through discussions within and outside of the HRSO Technical Committee, it became evident that organizations had their own interpretation of the normative references applicable to the REB's duties to hear requests for reconsiderations and for organizations to establish an appeal mechanism of REB's decisions. Often, appeals and reconsiderations were thought to be one and the same, when, for instance, the Tri-Council policy statement regards them as being two distinct processes. Other Canadian normative references are silent about the issue, although they require that researchers be informed of the REB's appeal procedures. The National Standard of Canada offers clarity by confirming the requirement for organizations to have distinct processes to manage requests for reconsiderations and appeal of REB decisions. Next slide, please. In some circumstances, the HRSO Technical Committee had to innovate by interpreting the normative documents to fill the areas where the normative references were silent, without overstepping and creating policy. A good example of this situation is subsection on concluding review. As previously mentioned, the National Standard of Canada interpreted the technical requirements for ethics review and oversight following the life cycle of a study. In this specific case, the technical committee took a step further than the normative references. The technical committee established a normalization of the interpretation of the normative references based on best practices adopted by some research organizations. The proposed new terminology, concluding review, provides a clearer representation of the reality of research with humans. It also emphasizes that the REB must conduct a review of the research before considering that a study is closed and that REB oversight is no longer required. Next slide, please. In order for this NSC to embrace all types of research with humans, tremendous efforts were made by the technical committee towards using language that would be neutral. Efforts were also made to avoid transposing normative references specific to one field of research as a one-size-fits-all to all types of research. One example is the development of the concept of negative impacts of research, which is defined as any event, whether anticipated or not, that does or could adversely affect research data integrity, the health, welfare, interests, or rights of research participants, investigators or researchers, and third parties such as families and communities, or the conduct of the research. Examples include, but are not limited to, breaches of privacy, adverse events, serious adverse events, incidental findings, and unanticipated problems. The concept of negative impacts of research allow organizations to tailor their processes for identifying, monitoring, mitigating, assessing, managing, and reporting negative impacts to the particular types of research under their auspices. I will now invite Alex to discuss the numerous benefits of adopting this NSC.
Thanks, Martin. National standards for human research promote uniform conduct and oversight of human research from one organization to another, one province to another, and internationally. National standards tell us what is required in order to meet current policies and other normative references. By eliminating the variability in interpreting policies and other normative references, national standards provide researchers with clear, concise requirements upon which they can develop their unique procedures. Until we started our initiative 3 years ago, no national standards existed in our country for the ethical conduct and oversight of human research, and indeed anywhere in the world. Consequently, human research was not conducted uniformly from one organization to another, and this often created barriers to harmonization, collaboration, causing unnecessarily delays and slowing the growth of the research sector within Canada and internationally. This is the reason that the development of national standards in human research is so important and will allow research to be conducted in a more consistent manner across the country and will cover all organizations, whether public or private, whether funded or not, and for whatever the type of research that is being undertaken without the need for further government intervention or regulation. Next slide, please. The National Standard of Canada for Ethical Review and Oversight of Human Research uses several strategies to help the user fulfill the requirements included in this standard. For example, the NSC has informative annexes which help in the understanding of the requirements by listing some examples and providing guidance to meet the requirements. These are not meant to be an exhaustive or complete list of examples, but rather to allow the user to better understand how the standards can be applied to different contexts and methodologies of human research. The wording of the requirements attempted to remove the variability of interpretation of the regulations, policies, guidelines that we observed over the past 20 years since the introduction of the TCPS. Indeed, as Martin presented in his review of the highlights of the NSC, some best practices were introduced so that organizations adopting the NSC can exceed the requirements in the normative Canadian policies and regulations. Organizations have the flexibility to customize their procedures to conform to the NSC while removing the need to be dependent on templated SOPs that may not reflect the organization's actual context. Next slide, please. Across the world, public and private organizations conducting and overseeing human research have adopted the Human Research Protection Program, or HRPP, as the most appropriate governance structure for human research protection oversight and human research accreditation as the currency of human research quality and efficiency. The organizational structures recommended by national standards will be responsible for the way education is designed and delivered to stakeholders and will be critical to creating and promoting a culture of research safety and quality and enhance the practice and oversight of researchers and healthcare professionals in those institutions. If organizations choose to undertake conformity assessment of their procedures against the established national standards through human research accreditation, then when these organizations collaborate with other accredited organizations, they will become part of a trust framework, not only nationally, but internationally. This term is normally used to describe the technologies and policies to enable and support a framework for secure digital transactions, but the concept would also be applicable and appropriate to describe and characterize the trust established between organizations that have been accredited against national standards for human research. Another major goal of accreditation is that an accredited HRPP can collaborate seamlessly with other accredited HRPPs, especially in the Canadian Federation and internationally. This would go a long way to bringing all Canadian research organizations on a level playing field without the need for further regulation or government intervention. The development of national standards will allow for the establishment of a trust framework for the conduct and oversight of research involving humans in Canada. As a leader in the establishment of standards in many sectors, Canada will now benefit from having national standards for human research, which will greatly influence health and healthcare organizations, a course of action that is optimal for transforming our research organizations into learning research institutions. I would like to thank my collaborators, Dr. Janice Parente and Martin Letendre for participation in the development of this presentation. I would also like to thank the Human Research Standards Organization, Human Research Accreditation Canada, Veritas IRB Inc., Ethica CRO Inc., and the Institute for Education Research at the University Health Network for their support. Thank you.